The funniest story I came across as a pastor in a previous church was when a family, this was at the end of daylight saving, and they sort of got it a bit wrong. And this family, young kids, always struggled to get to church on time. And at the end of daylight saving, instead of putting their clock back an hour, they put it forward an hour. And so they came very early to church that particular day. So anyway, well done. Several weeks ago, as part of our series on kingdom people, Tim Hines shared with us about how God communicated to the Apostle Paul through a vision of a man from a region in Europe called Macedonia. And so this man from Macedonia in the vision said, come over and help us. And this opened up a whole new chapter of ministry for the Apostle Paul and a new chapter for the spread of the gospel in regions where it hadn't been taken before. And so in this particular circumstance, God communicated through a vision. And you know, God communicates with us in a wide variety of ways. And this morning I'm wanting to draw on the story of Samuel so that we can see some further important aspects of what it means to listen to God. Now, I'm using the terminology of listening to God here, but we also could speak of it in other ways, like in terms of sight. Seeing what God is doing and being a part of that. Listening to God, hearing God, listening and being obedient. So Samuel was a priest and prophet for the Israelites, for the Jewish people. And he was someone that gave effective leadership to the Jewish people, the 12 tribes of Israel, over a long period of time. He was the prophet, he was the priest who ministered in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the building that they had before they had the great temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And he ministered and he led Israel for all these years, and then was the prophet and priest in the first part of King Saul's reign. He was someone who listened to God. And I want to ask a question to begin with this morning. Are you a good listener? Are you a good listener? Not in terms of listening to God here. And we'll just flick this back. Not in terms of listening to God. But just listening to other people. Surveys have been done of people's self-rating, self-perception as to whether they are good listeners or not. And these surveys tend to show that the majority of people rate themselves as good listeners. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands this morning in terms of whether you rate yourself as a good listener or not, or perhaps if I was very naughty, I could ask you to raise your hand, not for yourself, but to rate the person who is sitting next to you. Well, actually, if we did both, it would be interesting to see if there was any difference in the number of hands raised, wouldn't there? But I'm not going to do that this morning. Might cause some trouble. But seriously, though, it's important that in life we listen to other people. You know, the world desperately needs people who listen to God first of all, and in listening to God are able to listen to other people, who are able to listen to the heart cry of people and respond to them with the love of God. Beyonce Knowles is an American superstar. And here on the screen, she is pictured when she appeared in a film called Dreamgirls, a 2006 film, so it's 12 years ago now. And the main song in the film was called Listen, and she was one of the co-writers of this song. And in the film, she plays a character, a woman, who is controlled and belittled, put down by her husband. And the song in the film, the song called Listen, is a turning point where she stands up for herself and demands to be listened to. And she finds a voice. And some of the lyrics go like this: listen to the song here in my heart, a melody I start but can't complete. Listen to the sound from deep within. It's only beginning to find release. Oh, the time has come for my dreams to be heard. They will not be pushed aside and turned into your own, because you will not listen. People are crying out to be listened to be truly heard. And as we learn to listen to God, then we are much more able to respond to the heart cry of people. One of the stories I love in the New Testament is the story of Jesus, and he's on a journey. He's approaching Jericho, and on the outskirts of Jericho is a blind man called Bartimaeus. And he crawls out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And he keeps calling it out, and the crowd saying, shush, shush, Bartimaeus. And Jesus is traveling on, and there's a beautiful little phrase there. It says that Jesus stopped. That Jesus stopped. Jesus stopped and listened. What can I do for you, Bartimaeus? You see, Jesus listened to God. He was in touch. He was in relationship with his heavenly Father, and because he was listening to his Father, he was able to respond to the heart cry of Bartimaeus. And Samuel, in his own situation, was able to do just that as well. There were all types of challenges that Samuel was able to respond to because he listened to God, first of all. And in listening to God and being in tune with the heart of God, he was able to minister to the Jewish people and their heart cries. One of the scourges of life in ancient Israel was corruption and bribery. Of course, that's a problem in most of the world today. And Samuel knew that God's heart was against injustice and corruption and bribery. And near the end of his life, he was able to get up in front of the Jewish people and say, my hair is grey now, but here I stand before you. Whose ox have I taken? He asked the gathered people. Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? And the Jewish people were able to respond to Samuel and before God, you have done none of these things. You have ruled us justly. The story of Samuel begins not with Samuel listening, but with God listening. And that's the starting point. It's not as if God is asking us to do something that he doesn't do first. God listened. God listened to the woman who would in time become the mother of Samuel. Hannah. Hannah was married to Elkanah, but they had no children. And we read that Hannah came to God in bitterness of soul. That's how it's translated. In bitterness of soul. She was just deeply, deeply disappointed. She didn't know who else to turn to. She cried out to God. Hannah wept and prayed to the Lord God that God would give them a son. And Hannah promised the Lord that if she gave birth to a son, well, then she would dedicate him to the Lord's service. And then we find this beautiful phrase, the Lord remembered her. The Lord remembered her. God listened and responded to her cry. And Samuel was born. Sisters and brothers, we have a God who listens. And we have the Spirit of that God living within us. And just as God listens, His Spirit would lead us to listen to the heart cry of people. And as we move on in the story of Samuel, we see that the Lord called out to the boy Samuel, probably when he was about 12 years old. Samuel, the Lord called. Not once, not twice, 3 times, and each time Samuel thought it was the chief priest, Eli, calling out to him. So each time Samuel got up out of bed, went to Eli and said, Eli, you called? And Eli said, not me, not me. Go back to bed, Samuel. So Samuel trotted back. But on the 3rd time, Eli, he twigged. He understood what was happening here. And he said to Samuel, if you hear a voice call again, you respond, Lord, your servant is listening. And so the voice came a 4th time, and the response came from Samuel. Speak, for your servant is listening. Speak, for your servant is listening. And that was a marked aspect of the life of Samuel. Throughout his whole life, he listened to God. And the Lord honored him in this. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 19. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. None of Samuel's words fell to the ground. What does that mean? Well, the Message Bible translates or paraphrases it in this way. Samuel's prophetic record was flawless. In other words, people were already coming to Samuel even as a teenager. And he was able to give them a word from God, provide instruction. And his prophetic record was flawless. None of it fell to the ground. And the heart of this was that Samuel listened to God. Listening not just in the sense of hearing, but true listening that involved obedience, even when the message he had to deliver was an uncomfortable one. This was a mark of Samuel's life. Even at this very point, where God first spoke to him, God gave him a message for Eli. The message was this: Eli, God's judgment is going to be on your sons who are priests because they are using their position to exploit others. Samuel was reticent to deliver that message, but he did. God's blessing was upon Samuel. And a little bit later on, a long time later in the life of Samuel, the Jewish people were being threatened by the Ammonites, a people that live in modern-day Jordan. Amman comes, the capital of Jordan. That word comes from the word Ammon, the Ammonites. And the Jewish people were really feeling threatened by the Ammonites. And so they went to Samuel and said, well, look, the Ammonites, they're successful in their battles. Other nations have got a king. We want a king too. We want to be like all the other nations. And so Samuel said, he brought this message, no, the Lord is your king. You don't need an earthly king because you have God. Hasn't God provided the leaders and the leadership that were needed at the right time? So he brought this message to the Jewish people. It was ignored, of course. And God, as it were, adjusted his will to that situation and allowed the Jewish people to have a king. Samuel was faithful. But the question for us all is this: can we say, along with Samuel, "Speak, Lord, I am listening"? Speak, Lord, I am listening. Those of us nearing retirement years, have you drifted away from an earlier passion in life when you delighted in listening to God and obeying Him? Those in the middle years, have you allowed the responsibilities and busyness of those years to distract you from a wholehearted listening and obedience to God? Young person, perhaps you are caught in two minds. Some of the time you want to listen to God, but other times there are other voices that seem so loud and so attractive and enticing. And so you are caught in between. Whatever your situation in life is, there is no better way in life than being a person who says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Can you say those words from your heart? Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.